Hello and welcome to the Peoria Riverfront Museum. I'm John Morris, and on behalf of all of us at this extraordinary, one-of-a-kind, multidisciplinary museum of art, science, history, and achievement, I'm excited to invite you on this video tour of the most comprehensive exhibition of its kind in the nation this year, The Promise of Liberty, with guest curator, filmmaker Ken Burns, and curator and special advisor, the top documents expert in the country, Seth Kaller. We've brought together 250 objects of historic value, documents and works of art in one place. 13 different galleries and highlights including the 1776 printing of the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, the signed Emancipation Proclamation, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Here to take you on a tour of some of the highlights are the experts themselves. Please enjoy these next few minutes as we give you a peek inside the Promise of Liberty. We'll see you at the museum.
Hi, I'm Seth Kaller, founder of the promiseofliberty.org and curator of the exhibition and special advisor to the Peoria Riverfront Museum. Welcome to the Promise of Liberty. So why is this exhibit called The Promise of Liberty? Well, this is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, 2026. And we wanted to be able to show why the Declaration actually is still relevant to our lives today. And the title of the exhibition comes from the best speech making that case, which I think was by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his famous I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington in 1963. And in 1963, before the success of the Civil Rights Movement ends with the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, he had every reason to be angry and to write off the hypocritical proclamations of liberty by slaveholders. And instead, he thought of the positive, and he calls the Declaration and the Constitution a promissory note. And that's what we think of it here in the exhibit. So we aren't only focusing on the positive, we also talk about the paradox of liberty, where one person's liberty can be another person's loss. But what we really celebrate about the Declaration is that it creates this idea of a government that needs to be for the people and natural rights that all people should eventually be recognized as having. So what does the Declaration of Independence do? Well, it's the greatest breakup note in history, it's the greatest press release in history, and it creates a vision and aspiration of liberty that becomes the basis of our country. And it's right here in the second paragraph: we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Today, many people have a problem with that, thinking of it, weighing the founders in our context, as opposed to thinking of them in their time. They weren't delusional when they talked about all men are created equal. They were creating an aspirational vision for the country that would move towards liberty over time. Now, if you've seen the National Treasure, I'm sure you're thinking, that can't be the Declaration. Where are the signatures? But actually, this is a real Declaration of Independence broadside from July of 1776. That National Treasure document, that didn't exist until a month later. But really, when the Declaration passes, the greatest press release in history, the news has to get out very quickly. And the best technology for getting news out at that time were broadsides like this, or newspapers. The Declaration goes to the printer on the night of July 4th, and on July 5th, copies were starting to go out from Philadelphia. This particular copy was printed as soon as the news got to Massachusetts. The broadsides are single printed pages with all of the text on one side, so that it can be read and then quickly posted and shared for everybody else in the area to see. So they were often posted in churches and town halls, and that is how news of independence got out. This is the first public printing of the U.S. Constitution on September 19th, 1787. And what do we need to know about the Constitution? Well, it's really right up front in the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Almost every government before came with either the idea of divine connection or perfection. Certainly, it was very dangerous to one's health to question the legitimacy of the government. And here, we're acknowledging, in order to form a more perfect union, that America is going to be a work in progress, something always moving towards perfection. And right in the text of the Constitution, it includes the ability to amend it, to change it, because it knows that the human beings who created it are not perfect and can never create a perfect system that governs human beings. I think that this document needs to be considered not really just as history, but as technology. The founders were not creating something that they expected us, almost 250 years later, to interpret only by putting ourselves in their shoes and in their wigs and saying we must understand it based on the way that they understood it. Because that's not actually what the founders said or wanted. They were creating this as technology, as our operating system for the government. And in the cover letter that George Washington sent on behalf of the whole Constitutional Convention when it went to Congress and then to the states for ratification, he describes the trade-offs that are necessary. He says, in order to preserve liberty, we must give up a share of liberty. What people needed for their safety and security, it depended on where they were and the, quote, situation and circumstances, which they acknowledge are always changing. What we need from the government is always changing based on what's happening in the world. And they created this outline, this system, this technology of government that could be very reactive to the inputs, to what is happening. And so it talks about the compromises that they need to make in order to create a government. What's wonderful about it is how short it is. And then with very few changes, amendments, it's still a remarkably short document that governs a very complex nation. So if we can think about it as technology and play with it and get involved, we can use this to make the nation that we want to have.
Here we have Meriwether Lewis's tomahawk. In 1803, under President Thomas Jefferson, the United States acquired the territory of Louisiana from France for $15 million. The purchase of 530 million acres west of the Mississippi River nearly doubled the size of the country. In 1804, Thomas Jefferson commissioned Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the newly acquired Western territories. Lewis and Clark led a group known as the Corps of Discovery on one of the most important expeditions in U.S. history. Their main objectives were to identify a practical route to the Pacific Ocean and establish diplomatic relationships with Native American tribes along the way. This expedition laid the groundwork for the opening of the American West. This decorated pipe tomahawk, referred to as a presentation tomahawk, is one of the few original artifacts that survived the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was in Meriwether Lewis's possession upon his tragic death in 1809, and there is strong evidence that it was carried by him on the expedition. The quality of the craftsmanship is exceptional. Notice the beautiful figured maple handle with silver inlays and the oval inlay on the blade with the engraved initials ML, Meriwether Lewis. The maker of the tomahawk is unknown. This tomahawk skillfully combines a functional steel axe blade with a hollow handle and integrated pipe bowl, giving it both practical and diplomatic significance. Lewis carried it not only for utility and personal protection, but also as a symbol of authority and peace when meeting Native American tribes. The pipe was especially important as smoking together was a powerful gesture of diplomacy and mutual respect in many indigenous cultures. Presentation tomahawks were often gifted to tribal leaders during treaty negotiations or ceremonial meetings. By blending European metalworking and Native American cultural traditions, these objects became powerful diplomatic items, serving as tangible expressions of peace, authority, and mutual exchange. I would like to thank the Peterson family for their generous loan of this incredible object to the exhibition. It is a true national treasure.
One of my favorite objects in The Promise of Liberty is this amazing tin-type photographic image of Abraham Lincoln. The image was taken in 1858 in Peoria, Illinois. Abraham Lincoln had visited Peoria many times, actually, and in fact, 4 years before this visit was the occurrence of his famous Turning Point speech, in which he kind of established himself as an opponent to Stephen Douglas through the refutation of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and was moving towards sentiments of abolition. 4 years later, back in 1858, he is in Peoria, gathering a rallying crowd of about 3,000 people in hopes that they would attend the first Lincoln-Douglas debate in Ottawa, Illinois, 2 days later. And at the culmination of his visit, was asked by a young photographer here in Peoria named Roderick Cole if he would sit and have his image recorded. At which time, Lincoln famously said or asked why everybody wanted an image of him when he was the homeliest man in the state of Illinois. Despite that sentiment, he actually loved the image, liked it so much that it ended up making its way 2 years later in 1860 into his presidential campaign. So the image becomes the ideal of what Lincoln looked like before the presidency, his beardless, young, kind of aggressive upstart of a politician, and is pinioned in history by, of course, the gaunt and bearded, almost Moses-like Lincoln that we keep very closely in our thoughts when referring to him. It's an incredible image. It's an iconic image. It happens to be here in Peoria, Illinois at the Peoria Riverfront Museum, but most profoundly, the image was taken on the same block that the Peoria Riverfront Museum exists on now at the corner of Washington and Main Street, making this a really magical moment to have this image with us.
This is the Emancipation Proclamation, signed by Abraham Lincoln and authenticated by William Seward, the Secretary of State, and John Nicolay, Lincoln's private secretary. And what does the Emancipation Proclamation do? Well, as a war measure, it frees slaves only in areas that are still controlled by the Confederacy. Lincoln was always against slavery, but knew that he had to very carefully thread the needle and not get ahead of the public and not issue a document that would be overturned by the, at that point, still pro-slavery Supreme Court. So he does not include slaves in areas controlled by the Union. He needs to keep the border states. So he couldn't just act against slavery on his own. But what he does is, in the areas controlled by the Confederacy, he is, by virtue of the power and the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free. And then he goes on to what I think is the most revolutionary part of this document in the next paragraph. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. Now that sounds like Lincoln is talking to the freed slaves, but he's not actually. He's talking to the white people. And this warning that people should abstain from violence unless in necessary self-defense, well, they know to abstain from violence. They're the ones who don't have the weapons. But unless in necessary self-defense is Lincoln's best, purest, most succinct reaction to the Dred Scott decision, which is what got Lincoln back into politics. And the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court said that the black man has no rights which the white man is bound to respect. Here, Lincoln turns it around. He echoes what Frederick Douglass has been saying all along, which is the most important right is the right to bodily integrity, the right to own your own body, the right to protect your body. And by including in here necessary self-defense, he's actually righting that great wrong of the Dred Scott decision. One of the aims of the Emancipation Proclamation was to make it easier to recruit black troops who were desperately needed in the Union ranks. And so as an immediate result of the proclamation, we have this, Frederick Douglass and others, who were at first lukewarm supporters of the war, when it was just a war to preserve the Union, but not a war against slavery. They had reason to be concerned. But now with the Emancipation Proclamation, as the Union Army moves on, it is an army of liberation, and now this is a war of liberation. And so Frederick Douglass and others are issuing this fantastic text recruiting black troops to fight for the Union. And 3 of Frederick Douglass's own sons signed up as a result of this. These kind of broadsides, they're extremely rare. There are only 4 or 5 copies known this size. It would have been posted on the outside of a building, and of course, very few would survive. And Lincoln knew that the Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure. It didn't change the fundamental equation of slavery throughout the whole country. And he knew that if we won the war without abolishing slavery, that ultimately there would have to be another war. And so he pushed very much for the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the country. This is one of the very rare copies signed by William Seward, sent to the states so that the states would vote and ratify the amendment. So this is the amendment to the US Constitution that is really the start of our refounding as a free nation.
This is a letter written in 1880 by Frederick Douglass to George Townsend. George Townsend had published some articles criticizing Robert Ingersoll. Robert Ingersoll was living in Peoria, Illinois at the time. He actually lived in Peoria for over 20 years, and he was a lawyer. He was a well-known author, thought leader, and kind of a provocative figure. He was willing to speak his mind, and not everybody agreed with him. So George Townsend had written some criticizing articles about Ingersoll, and Frederick Douglass wrote this letter that you can see on display to defend Ingersoll's character, describing the hospitality he received from Ingersoll back when he visited Peoria in the past. He is quoted as saying in the letter, "I dreaded going to Peoria, for I expected to be compelled to walk the streets all night to keep from freezing. As the last time I was in Peoria, no hotel in that city would receive me." Douglass contrasted his first experience with the warm welcome he received from Robert Ingersoll years later. Douglass recalled returning to town with all the sin of my hated complexion upon me, only to be warmed by Ingersoll's fire and made at home under his roof. I like this letter because it shows that Ingersoll was willing to bulk the conventions of the time, to host Frederick Douglass in his home, and showed him warm hospitality. I think that that reflects greatly on Robert Ingersoll, and I also think it reflects greatly on the city of Peoria in the past, in 1880, and hopefully on our city of gratitude today.
Our next stop is Charles White's full-color study of the contribution of the Negro to democracy in America. This powerful drawing highlights the essential role that Black Americans have played in building American democracy. Created in 1943 during World War II, the artwork shows strong Black figures, workers, soldiers, and everyday citizens standing together as symbols of labor, resistance, and patriotism. White challenges the contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while denying full rights to Black Americans at home. Through bold, realistic imagery and dignified portrayals, White argues that African Americans have always contributed, through work, sacrifice, culture, and struggle, to the nation's democratic ideals. White feels as though art is his best way of fighting against struggle and making a stance. The message here is clear and well situated within this exhibition. Democracy in America is incomplete without racial equality.
In this corner of the exhibition, we have a case dedicated to Betty Friedan, featuring some objects related to her work.
On February 4th, 1921, in a quiet room at Proctor Hospital, a child who would one day transform American understanding of women's lives and aspirations was born. Betty Friedan was born Betty Goldstein in Peoria, Illinois. She excelled academically, graduating as valedictorian of Peoria High School, where she wrote for the school newspaper and developed her early political and literary voice. Leaving Peoria for Smith College, Betty continued to explore psychology, writing, and political issues. After graduating in 1942, she worked as a journalist in New York, reporting on labor and workplace discrimination, especially against women. This work, combined with her own experiences as a suburban housewife and mother, inspired her to investigate the widespread frustration that many women felt. This resulted in her landmark 1963 book called The Feminine Mystique, which gave voice to a problem that had no name. It ignited a national call for expanded roles and opportunities for women everywhere. Spurred by the momentum of the book, Friedan helped found the National Organization for Women in 1966, known as NOW. Her leadership and public influence were essential during its early years. As its first president, she pushed the organization to confront sex discrimination in employment, pressuring the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to enforce federal law challenging discriminatory employment policies, helping to secure an executive order banning sex discrimination among federal contractors. In the years that followed, Friedan continued to influence national policy and advocacy. She helped found the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971 and strongly supported the Equal Rights Amendment as it advanced through Congress and into the state ratification campaigns. In 1978, Betty returned to her hometown Peoria to lead a local demonstration in support of ERA's ratification in the Illinois legislature. Friedan's later career expanded beyond political activism. She continued writing and speaking, producing works that examined both feminism's evolution and the experiences of aging. Through these efforts, she remained a central figure in American public life, offering critiques about gender and societal change. Although she spent most of her adult life far from Illinois, Betty Friedan's lifelong drive towards equality and her determination to reshape American society grew from the intellectual restlessness she first cultivated in Peoria, transforming not only the lives of women nationwide, but the cultural fabric of the country itself.
And here we have the bookend of the exhibit, which starts with the Declaration of Independence, and this is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech from the March on Washington, which gives the exhibit its name, by calling the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence a promissory note. If you read the whole speech, you'll notice I called it the I Have a Dream speech, but that's not here. Well, Dr. King was supposed to give a 5-minute speech. This is the text of the 5-minute speech. This was printed between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. the morning of. And what happened is, right before he comes to the last paragraph, Mahalia Jackson calls out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And he goes off script for a little more than 8 minutes talking about the dream. And then he comes back and finishes exactly as he had planned to before. So in this whole exhibit, the idea of America, the first country founded on an ideal, an idea, an aspiration of liberty that did not describe the nation in 1776 or in 1787 when the Constitution was written, or in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, or even in 1963, or even today. It's an aspiration that every generation has to fight for. The idea of liberty and of all that we can achieve when this country brings people together into a nation that truly deserves to be thought of as a nation of freedom and liberty.
So there you have it, The Promise of Liberty, the highlights tour on video. Hope you've enjoyed it. We thank the sponsors, the Visionary Society members, the members of the museum. This private nonprofit organization runs because of you, and we are so grateful. This America 250 year will be very special for all of us across the country as we think about the promise of liberty. And we'll see you at the museum. Thanks for your support.